It started quietly, no explosions, no headlines, just the eerie sound of ocean wind over silent docks. 7 of the world's busiest ports, from Asia to Europe, simultaneously stopped accepting U.S. shipments. Cargo cranes froze midair. Ships drifted offshore, waiting for orders that would never come. In one day, global trade changed forever. This wasn't caused by war or weather or terrorism. It was caused by politics, by an American president's decision to weaponize tariffs far beyond anything the world had ever seen. The plan was to make America strong again. But instead, it shattered confidence in U.S. trade, and within hours, the economic shockwaves reached every corner of the world. Auto plants stopped, supermarket prices spiked, and Wall Street lost billions before the weekend even began. What started as a political flex had turned into a full-blown global rebellion, ports refusing U.S. goods, allies breaking ranks, and rivals celebrating America's chaos. Because this wasn't a trade war anymore. This was an economic mutiny, one that would test whether the United States could still command respect in the world shipping lanes. This is Northern Pulse. And this is how the world stopped taking America's cargo. August 2025 will be remembered as the month the oceans went still. Ships carrying American goods were turned away at 7 major ports, from Shenzhen to Rotterdam, from Singapore to Vancouver. The official reason was tariff instability. The real message was simpler. The world had lost patience with Washington's chaos. What started as a bold tariff campaign meant to pressure China had spiraled into a global revolt. Trading partners couldn't keep up with constant rule changes, sanctions, and retaliations. Cargo schedules collapsed. And by the time the White House realized what was happening, billions in exports were stranded mid-ocean. In Seattle, dock workers stared at half-empty berths. In Hamburg, European officials called it the largest synchronized trade standstill since World War II. Markets panicked. Within 48 hours, auto production lines in Detroit were halted for lack of imported components. Major retailers slashed inventories as containers piled up offshore. The global economy, once lubricated by the smooth rhythm of ships, was now gridlocked by political shockwaves. But for the United States, the true heart of the crisis was closer to home. Because while the world was turning away from U.S. trade, America's own ports were collapsing under the weight of its own policies. For decades, the Port of Los Angeles wasn't just America's largest seaport. It was the heartbeat of U.S. trade, the engine behind $500 billion in economic activity. Every container that passed through its docks represented America's connection to the world. But in May 2025, that heartbeat faltered. It started when the Trump administration raised tariffs on Chinese goods to a staggering 145%, the highest in modern history. Almost instantly, cargo ships scheduled to dock at Los Angeles rerouted or canceled their trips altogether. Within weeks, port traffic dropped by over 5%, the equivalent of 224,000 containers vanishing from the system. Entire shipping lanes went quiet. Dock workers who once moved freight around the clock now stood idle, their shifts cut by nearly half. Truck drivers waited in endless lines for cargo that never arrived. Warehouses that once overflowed with imports from China now echoed with emptiness. Auto plants, electronics manufacturers, and retailers began rationing parts and supplies just to stay open another week. Even after Washington and Beijing reached a so-called 90-day truce, lowering tariffs temporarily to 30%, the damage was irreversible. Businesses had lost faith in the stability of U.S. trade policy. As Goldman Sachs analyst Laura Chen put it, we're witnessing inflation packed into every single container. Every week that passed meant more losses for companies, for workers, and for consumers. Prices rose, profits fell, and America's supply chain revealed how fragile it had become. The once mighty Port of Los Angeles, once a symbol of power and prosperity, now stood as a warning. When politics play with economics, it's not the politicians who pay the price. And just a few miles south, another critical artery of America's trade network was about to collapse: Long Beach. Just down the coast from Los Angeles sits the Port of Long Beach, America's other maritime powerhouse. For decades, it worked in perfect sync with Los Angeles, forming a trade superhub that kept the nation's factories humming and store shelves full. But in the summer of 2025, that rhythm broke. What had once been a symbol of unstoppable growth became the latest victim of Washington's tariff war. By May, Long Beach's cargo volumes had plunged nearly 30% compared to the previous year. More than 150,000 containers simply disappeared from shipping schedules, as dozens of global routes were canceled overnight. The number of missed sailings tripled in just a month. Mario Cordero, the port's executive director, called it a historic downturn, the sharpest reversal we've ever seen. The irony: only weeks earlier, April had been the port's busiest month on record. Ships were stacked side by side, cranes roared nonstop, and business leaders boasted of America's trade resilience. Then the tariffs hit, and the docks went silent. Corporate giants like Amazon, Walmart, and Target froze their import orders. Auto manufacturers halted parts shipments from Asia, forcing temporary shutdowns in Michigan and Ohio. Truckers sat parked for days, their paychecks shrinking as cargo vanished. Warehouse workers were sent home early, unsure if they'd still have jobs next week. The human cost was visible everywhere, from the empty diner across the street from the terminal to the laid-off dockworker staring at the horizon, wondering when the ships would return. For the first time in modern memory, the Pacific coast wasn't roaring with trade, it was whispering defeat. And as the crisis deepened, that silence began spreading inland toward Oakland, where America's farmers were about to face a nightmare of their own. While Los Angeles and Long Beach struggled to move electronics and cars, Oakland faced a different kind of disaster, one that hit America's farms and food producers straight at the heart. For decades, the Port of Oakland had been the gateway for U.S. agriculture, frozen foods, and manufactured exports heading to Asia. But by early summer 2025, that gateway had all but slammed shut. Between April and June, 39 empty sailings were canceled, slashing vessel availability and leaving exporters stranded. Shipments of beef, grains, and fruits that were supposed to reach Asian markets sat in cold storage for weeks, racking up massive costs. Containers of perishable food began to spoil under the California sun. Farmers who had already endured droughts and rising fuel prices were now losing their biggest overseas buyers overnight. Oakland's maritime director, Brian Brands, didn't sugarcoat it. "This isn't a seasonal slowdown," he said. "It's a restructuring of global trade." And that restructuring was brutal. Cargo volumes dropped over 13% compared to the previous year. Imports fell, exports dried up, and hundreds of small trucking firms dependent on agricultural shipping faced closure. The crisis revealed something few in Washington seemed to grasp, that tariffs weren't just numbers on paper. They were life and death for small businesses, for family farms, for the workers who made America's food exports a global success story. Every delay, every canceled ship meant another lost paycheck, another spoiled crop. Even Oakland, once praised for its resilience, couldn't escape the ripple effects of the tariff war. The docks grew quieter, the warehouses emptied. And as the agricultural losses piled up, the shock spread further north to the Pacific Northwest, where Seattle and Tacoma were about to experience their own economic collapse. Up in the Pacific Northwest, the ports of Seattle and Tacoma, known together as the Northwest Seaport Alliance, had always been symbols of American efficiency and innovation. They connected the United States to Asia's fastest-growing economies and kept billions of dollars in exports moving smoothly across the Pacific. But by the spring of 2025, that steady rhythm had broken. The docks that once buzzed with nonstop activity were suddenly silent. Cargo throughput in May fell by almost 30%, and in Seattle alone, volumes plunged by nearly 40%. Entire container lines vanished from schedules. Rail activity dropped by 24%, and trucking slowed by another 16%, forcing layoffs across every level of the logistics chain. For dock workers and truckers, the downturn was devastating. Paychecks cut in half, shifts canceled, and union halls filled with men and women desperate for work. Port Commissioner Ryan Calkins put it bluntly, "When the ports weaken, the U.S. economy follows." And that's exactly what began to happen. Warehouses emptied, freight companies folded, and local industries, from seafood exports to tech manufacturing, began to stall. The once booming Seattle skyline, a symbol of prosperity, now looked out over idle ships and stacked containers that no one could afford to move. Economists warned that this wasn't a temporary slowdown. It was the first stage of a maritime recession, one spreading through the arteries of the U.S. economy. The Pacific Northwest, once America's gateway to Asia, had become another casualty of the tariff war. Jobs were vanishing, prices were rising, and the storm that started at the docks was now creeping inland, threatening the factories and homes that depended on these ports to survive. But even as the West Coast crumbled, the East Coast believed it could withstand the shock, until Savannah and Newark began to choke. On the other side of the country, the East Coast was bracing for impact, and it came faster than anyone expected. The Port of Savannah, one of America's busiest gateways for retail and manufacturing imports, had just finished its second strongest year on record. In March and April 2025, ships lined up for miles as companies rushed to stockpile goods before Trump's massive tariffs took effect. For a moment, it looked like Savannah was thriving. But that boom was the calm before the storm. By June, the momentum reversed. Container traffic collapsed nearly 10% year over year, with warehouses overflowing and rail yards jammed to capacity. The CEO of the Georgia Ports Authority, Griff Lynch, called it a period of deep uncertainty. He warned that no amount of preparation could offset the shock caused by the sudden swings in U.S. trade policy. Manufacturers in Georgia and Alabama began halting production as imported parts, from engine modules to home appliances, got trapped in the gridlock. Further north, the situation at Newark Elizabeth, part of the New York-New Jersey port system, was even more alarming. Container volumes plunged 29%, truck traffic slowed to a crawl, and thousands of logistics workers faced layoffs. Analysts at Moody's predicted that East Coast consumer prices would rise between 4% and 6% within months, a direct result of supply chain paralysis. Even the most advanced ports couldn't escape. Every tariff hike, every policy tweet, every canceled voyage sent ripples through the system. Freight costs soared, inflation tightened its grip, and trust in American trade leadership began to crumble. The East Coast, once seen as the stable backbone of U.S. commerce, was now gasping for air. And while Washington scrambled for solutions, one nation across the Pacific was already exploiting the chaos: China. While American ports were grinding to a halt, across the Pacific, China's Yantian port in Shenzhen was overflowing with opportunity. When Washington and Beijing agreed to a 90-day tariff truce in May 2025, the world expected calm. Instead, China saw an opening. In just 1 week, bookings from China to the U.S. skyrocketed by 277%, flooding the docks with containers and pushing the global logistics system to its breaking point. Freight forwarders reported fully booked vessels weeks in advance. Cargo brokers were bidding for berthing space like it was gold. Rates for trans-Pacific shipments surged daily. What looked like chaos was, in reality, strategy. Beijing had turned America's temporary pause into a weapon, using the tariff lull to unleash a tidal wave of exports before the next round of U.S. policy whiplash. For American importers, the result was financial pain. Prices on critical goods, auto parts, computer chips, and consumer electronics exploded. U.S. companies were paying record shipping costs just to stay afloat. Meanwhile, China's factories worked around the clock, keeping its economy humming while the U.S. supply chain collapsed under its own tariffs. HSBC trade analyst Li Kaiwang called it a structural paralysis. And he was right. The backlog at Yantian became a mirror image of America's failure, proof that Beijing could play the game better. Every container that left Shenzhen was more than a shipment, it was a statement. China had adapted, redirected, and reasserted control. The U.S., weighed down by its own policies, was now the one chasing stability. By the time Washington realized what had happened, the map of global trade had redrawn itself, with China at the center and America stranded on the sidelines. What began as a political gamble had turned into a global reckoning. The Trump administration's tariffs were supposed to make America stronger, to force the world to play by Washington's rules. Instead, they broke the system that America itself had built. From Los Angeles to Shenzhen, every port told the same story: chaos, collapse, and a quiet rebellion against U.S. dominance. For decades, the United States had dictated the flow of trade. Its ports were the world's pulse, its dollar the world's language. But in 2025, that illusion shattered. Ships that once carried American goods were turned away. Partners that once relied on U.S. markets found new allies in Asia and Europe. And the world's busiest seaports, once symbols of globalization, became battlegrounds of economic defiance. At home, the fallout was brutal. Factory floors went dark. Food prices soared. Families paid more for everything from cars to groceries, while millions watched their savings shrink. Inflation wasn't just a number anymore, it was a daily reality born from political arrogance and global retaliation. The ports had stopped moving, but something far larger had shifted: power itself. The world no longer revolved around Washington's economic orbit. It had begun rotating around new centers in Beijing, in Brussels, in New Delhi. Tariffs, once tools of leverage, had become weapons of self-destruction. And as ships sat idle, one truth became impossible to ignore: this wasn't just a shipping crisis. It was the first stage of a new world order, one no longer led by the United States. The silence of the ports had become the sound of change. And for the first time in generations, America was no longer steering the global economy, it was struggling to keep up with it.